On the 28th of February 2026, the first bombs fell on Iran. Pause 2s, within hours, before most people had finished reading the headline, the price of oil jumped. Within days it had surged past $100 a barrel. Within a week it touched $120. Pause 1.5s, most people watching the news saw a military story. What was actually happening, simultaneously, invisibly, automatically, was a financial story. A story about how a conflict thousands of kilometers away reached directly into the wallet of every person on Earth. This video explains exactly how that transmission works. 4 mechanisms. Real current numbers. And the answer to the question nobody on the news is asking, why does a war in the Middle East always end up costing you money? To understand why oil prices move so dramatically during Middle East conflicts, you need to understand one number. 20%. Pause 2s, 20% of all the oil consumed on Earth every single day passes through a single narrow waterway. The Strait of Hormuz, a channel just 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Every day, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through that strait on their way to China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Europe. Pause 1.5s, when that strait is threatened, 20% of global oil supply disappears from the market. Not slows down. Disappears. The current conflict has produced exactly this outcome. The largest supply disruption in recorded history, more than double the Suez Crisis of 1956. Pause 2s, that is why $120 happened. That is why $200 is being discussed. And that is why this matters to your wallet whether you live in Manchester, Mumbai, or Manila. The first mechanism is the most direct. Supply destruction. Pause 1s, oil is a global commodity with a global price. When supply falls anywhere in the world, the price rises everywhere in the world. This is not a regional effect. It is a mathematical consequence of how commodity markets work. Pause 1.5s, the current conflict has removed approximately 20% of global daily oil supply. The strait closure means Gulf producers cannot move their oil to buyers. The oil exists. The production capacity exists. But the delivery mechanism has been severed. Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, halted all gas production after drone strikes. European natural gas prices nearly doubled overnight. Pause 2s, before the conflict, $70 per barrel. Conflict removed 20% of supply. Oil surged 50% to $120. Same demand. Less supply. Higher price. Even if the conflict ended today, prices could remain elevated until late 2026 or early 2027. Physical infrastructure takes far longer to restore than markets take to price the disruption. The supply shock is the mechanism most people understand intuitively: less oil, higher price. Pause 1s, what most people do not understand is that the supply shock is only the beginning. It triggers 3 further mechanisms that compound the initial price increase and spread it far beyond the energy sector. Pause 1.5s, the oil price increase is the stone dropped in the water. What follows, the ripples that reach every corner of the economy, is where the real financial damage to ordinary people occurs. The second mechanism is the transport cost cascade. This is how oil prices reach your supermarket shelf, even if you never buy petrol. Pause 1s, everything you consume was transported to reach you. The food on your plate. The clothes you wear. The electricity in your home. Every step in every supply chain uses energy, and that energy just increased 50%. Pause 1.5s, transport costs are the hidden price of oil inside every product. When oil goes from $70 to $120, 71% increase. Haulage companies pass higher fuel costs to distributors, distributors to retailers, retailers to consumers. The U.S. average petrol price rose from $3 to $3.45 per gallon in the first week. 15% in 7 days. Pause 2s, agricultural goods are particularly exposed. Diesel machinery, gas, fertilizer, long-distance transport. When energy rises 50%, food costs follow. The transport cost cascade is why oil price increases do not stay at the petrol station, they raise the cost of everything that moves, which is everything. The transport cost cascade has a compounding feature that most economic analysis underestimates. POV 1's transport costs are embedded in the production of every input at every manufacturing stage. Steel requires coking coal to be transported. Semiconductors require rare earth materials shipped across borders. Pharmaceutical ingredients cross multiple borders before reaching a factory. POV 1.5's when transport costs rise, they rise simultaneously at every stage of every supply chain. The cost increase compounds, does not simply add once. A product that crosses 5 supply chain stages absorbs 5 separate transport cost increases. This is why a 50% rise in oil produces broad, persistent, multi-sector inflation far more durable than the initial oil price move itself. The third mechanism is the inflation feedback loop. This is where the oil price shock stops being an energy story and becomes a monetary story. POV 1's when oil prices rise sharply, central banks face an immediate dilemma. Higher oil prices push consumer price inflation upward. The central bank's mandate is to keep inflation low. The tool it uses, raising interest rates. Higher interest rates slow economic growth. POV 1.5's the dilemma. The inflation from high oil prices is a supply-side shock, caused by less supply, not excessive demand. Raising interest rates does nothing to increase oil supply. It cannot reopen the Strait of Hormuz. It cannot bring the missing barrels back, but the central bank must still respond, because if oil-driven inflation becomes embedded in wage expectations, a second wave begins. Workers demand higher wages. Companies raise prices. Inflation becomes self-sustaining. POV 2's core inflation could reach 4% by end 2026 if conflict extends. Fed expected to delay rate cuts until 2027. Higher interest rates have direct costs. Mortgage rates rise. Business loans increase. Consumer credit becomes expensive. The oil shock reaches monthly payments of people who have never thought about oil. The inflation feedback loop has a distributional consequence that compounds its economic damage. POV 1's higher interest rates protect existing wealth holders. Property owners see asset values remain broadly stable. Financial asset holders can move to higher-yielding instruments. POV 1.5's renters face rising rents as landlords pass financing costs through. Fixed-income people face full inflation with no compensation. Young people entering the housing market face the double hit of higher prices and higher borrowing costs. The transmission is universal, it reaches everyone. But the impact is not equal. It falls hardest on those with the least financial resilience. 6 things to understand about how a Middle East oil shock drains every wallet on Earth. POV 1's 1. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important energy choke point on Earth. 20% of global daily oil supply transits this 33-kilometer channel. Any conflict that closes this waterway produces an immediate global price shock. 2. The supply shock is the trigger but not the full story. 20% of supply gone. Prices spike. But the supply shock activates a chain reaching every sector of every economy. 3. The transport cost cascade is how oil prices enter every product you buy. Higher fuel costs compound across multiple production stages before reaching the consumer as broad inflation. 4. The inflation feedback loop turns an energy shock into a monetary shock. Central banks respond even when they cannot fix the supply problem. Higher rates raise borrowing costs for everyone. 5. The distributional impact is not equal. Falls hardest on renters, fixed-income households, and those with the least financial resilience. 6. The recovery takes longer than the conflict. Prices could remain elevated until late 2026 or early 2027. Financial damage outlasts the military events, sometimes by years. 1 straight. 20% of global supply. For mechanisms. Pause 2s, the supply disappears. The transport costs cascade. The inflation feedback loop activates. And the distributional impact falls hardest on those who can least afford it. A conflict in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. It travels, through oil prices, through supply chains, through interest rates, until it reaches the wallet of every person on Earth. Pause 1.5s, that is not geopolitics. That is mechanics. And mechanics can be understood. Hit like and subscribe to FINOBOARD. In every video we decode one financial system with real numbers and no agenda. Pause 1s, share this with one person who has ever watched oil prices rise during a conflict and wondered why their grocery bill went up too.